Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into a truly fascinating legal mystery from the Philippine Supreme Court, Suarez versus Emboy. For law students, practitioners, or honestly anyone interested in how property law actually works in the real world, this is a must-know case. It perfectly illustrates a vital concept: why having a shiny new certificate of title in your hands doesn't automatically give you a free pass to bypass the strict rules of prior physical possession. We're going to unpack the absolute necessity of that prior physical possession, the crucial differences between property recovery actions, and what happens when the rigid letter of the law collides with the equitable protection of a family's ancestral home. Let's get into it.
We're going to structure this explainer exactly like a classic law school case brief. We'll track the facts, map out the legal arsenal available to the parties, and then break down the Supreme Court's ultimate verdict.
But before we get totally lost in the rigid legal frameworks, let's establish the deeply human stakes at play here.
So let's look at how this conflict actually unfolded, because the sequence of these filings becomes absolutely critical to the final outcome. At the center of this dispute is a 220 square meter parcel of land in Cebu City, designated as Lot 1907A2. And sitting right on the slot is the ancestral house of the respondents, siblings Felix Emboy Jr. and Mary Lou Emboy Delantar. Now, decades ago, back in 1957, certain heirs allegedly executed a waiver of their hereditary rights to this land. The Emboys actually found this document miraculously sitting in an old wooden chest in their home. Fast forward to February 2004, a woman named Carmencita claims she bought the lot from the registered owners and sends a demand letter telling the Emboys to pack up and vacate. But the Emboys don't just leave, they investigate. They find potential forgeries in the land partition, and they proactively file a civil petition in August 2004 to nullify the whole partition. 4 months later, in December, Carmencita strikes back. She files an unlawful detainer suit to evict them. The race to the courthouse has officially begun, and remember, the Emboys filed their nullification suit first. That is going to be a huge factor later on.
Okay, before we hit the courtroom, we really need to pause and define the specific legal weapons these parties had at their disposal to recover the land.
In Philippine law, you absolutely cannot just recover land by force, no matter what kind of official documents you're holding. You have to choose the exact right judicial remedy. For summary actions, the fast-track ones, you have two choices: forcible entry and unlawful detainer. In forcible entry, the defendant's possession was illegal from day one. Think someone sneaking in through stealth or using force or intimidation to take the land. The court only cares about one thing here: prior physical possession. Who was there first? But unlawful detainer is a completely different beast. In this case, the possession is originally lawful. Maybe there was a lease, or maybe the owner just tolerated them being there. But it becomes illegal the moment that permission is revoked. If you're a lawyer and you choose the wrong one of these two, it's completely fatal to your case.
Now, what happens if you miss that strict one-year window to file those summary actions? Well, jurisdiction shifts. You have to elevate your case to an Accion Publiciana. This is an action directed at the person to determine who has the better right of possession, totally independently of who actually owns the land. And because it's a plenary action, meaning it's a full-blown trial, it gets filed in the regional trial court, not the municipal courts.
And if the core issue isn't just about who gets to physically possess the land right now, but who legally holds the title, that's when you bring out the heavy artillery, the Accion Reivindicatoria. This is an ordinary civil proceeding to conclusively resolve de jure ownership. Keep these three distinct tiers of actions in the back of your mind, because the Supreme Court is going to use them to entirely dismantle the plaintiff's legal strategy.
Because Carmencita chose to file an unlawful detainer, she was legally required to prove some very specific things right out of the gate.
A plaintiff must establish all four of these jurisdictional facts on the very face of their complaint. First, you have to prove the defendant's initial possession was lawful, meaning it was either by a contract or your explicit tolerance. Second, you must prove that possession became illegal because you explicitly terminated their right to be there. Third, the defendant stubbornly stayed anyway. And fourth, you filed the lawsuit within exactly 1 year from your last demand to vacate. It's a rigid checklist. If the complaint lacks even one of these factual allegations, the municipal court is completely stripped of jurisdiction to even hear the case.
So let's look at how the lower courts initially interpreted Carmencita's evidence. Armed with her brand new transfer certificate of title, Carmencita basically argued that as the new owner, she had the absolute right to terminate the supposed tolerance given to the Emboys. And you know what? The lower courts essentially looked at her shiny new title and concluded that ownership equates to the immediate right of possession. Both the municipal trial court in cities and the regional trial court ruled right in her favor. They ordered the Emboys to vacate the lot, remove all improvements, which literally meant tearing down their ancestral home, and even pay attorney's fees. But this brilliantly illustrates the central legal mystery of our explainer. Did Carmencita actually prove her case according to those strict rules we just outlined? Or did she just heavily rely on her title?
Well, the Court of Appeals, and ultimately the Supreme Court, took a much closer look at the actual text of her complaint.
And what they found was a fatal defect in her legal strategy. You see, the Supreme Court pointed out that tolerance implies a distinct, overt act of permission. But Carmencita's complaint didn't even state how the Emboys entered the land. It was completely silent on how, when, or by whom this supposed tolerance actually began. The reality on the ground was that the Emboys had been sitting on that land for decades, long before Carmencita's predecessors even owned the property. The court basically said you cannot tolerate a possession that predates your own claim to the land. Because she failed to prove the very first jurisdictional fact, initial lawful entry by tolerance, the municipal court frankly never had jurisdiction to begin with. The Supreme Court ruled that if she truly believed she owned the land, she shouldn't have taken a shortcut. She should have filed an Accion Reivindicatoria in the regional trial court.
But what's even more fascinating is how the Supreme Court dealt with that overlapping ownership lawsuit the Emboys had filed months earlier.
Normally, as a general rule, a pending civil action about who actually owns a property does not justify suspending an eviction proceeding. But the court applied a specific doctrine here, the Amagan versus Amagan Doctrine. They carved out a critical, equitable exception, stating that when executing the eviction would cause irreparable harm, like tearing down a family's home, while ownership is still legitimately disputed, equity demands a pause.
This step-by-step logic shows exactly why the court hit the brakes on the eviction. First, this exception only applies if the suit is unlawful detainer, not forcible entry. Think about it. If it were forcible entry, where someone violently stole the land, the court would evict him immediately, regardless of any ongoing ownership dispute. This circles back perfectly to the absolute vital importance of prior physical possession. The law fiercely protects whoever was there peaceably first. Second, the issue of ownership has to be seriously contested in a proper court, which the Emboys were absolutely doing with their nullification suit. And third, executing the eviction would permanently destroy a family's home while the courts are still figuring out who actually holds the legal title. It would be an irreparable injustice.
A title doesn't give you a magic wand to bypass proper procedure. Prior physical possession holds massive weight in the eyes of the law. If you want to displace someone who has been quietly living on a piece of land for decades, you absolutely must strictly follow the required legal avenues. I want to leave you with this powerful statement from the jurisprudence cited in the ruling, reminding us that peaceable, quiet possession cannot be undone by a strong hand or a flawed legal shortcut. So, what do you think? Does the strictness of procedural law in property disputes like this serve true justice, or does it unnecessarily overcomplicate ownership? That is all for this explainer. Keep analyzing, keep learning, and we'll catch you on the next one.